Every year, just before Christmas, Mr. David's family traveled to their village. It was a tradition. The children loved the excitement of meeting their cousins, playing in the open fields, and listening to stories from the elders. Lisa, his wife, enjoyed the warmth of the village, where life was simple, unlike the noisy and busy city where they lived. But this year something felt different. Lisa couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. She had been having strange dreams, dark shadows moving, whispers in the wind, voices warning her about the trip. She didn't understand what it all meant, but her heart told her to pray. "David, we need to pray about this journey," she said one evening as she prepared dinner. Mr. David scoffed, shaking his head. "Lisa, not this again. We have been traveling to the village for years. Nothing has ever happened. But this time I feel something is wrong," Lisa insisted. Their children, Daniel and Rachel, overheard the conversation and laughed. "Mommy, why are you always praying?" Daniel asked. "You act like something bad will happen," Rachel added. Lisa looked at her children, her heart heavy. Mr. David's attitude towards prayer had rubbed off on them. He was a good husband and father, but he never believed in spiritual things. He always said, "Faith is for weak people." That night, after everyone went to bed, Lisa knelt beside the bed and prayed, "God, I don't know what's coming, but please protect my family." Little did she know, darkness was already lurking in the shadows. A few days before their departure, Mr. David went to fix his car. While walking back home, he saw an old woman sitting by the roadside, watching him intently. Her eyes were sharp, almost glowing. Something about her made Mr. David uncomfortable. "You should not travel," the woman said suddenly. Mr. David frowned. "What?" "There is danger on your path. If you travel, you will not return the same. Pray or do not go." He laughed. "Madam, stop scaring people with your superstitions. Nothing will happen." The woman shook her head. "You have been warned." Mr. David walked away, shaking his head. "These old village women and their nonsense," he muttered. When he got home, he didn't mention it to Lisa. He didn't want her to use it as an excuse to start praying again. Meanwhile, in the village, Mama Grace sat in her dimly lit hut, her face twisted in anger. She was Mr. David's stepmother, but she had never truly loved him. When he was a child, she treated him badly, favoring her own sons instead. But life had been cruel to them. While Mr. David grew into a successful man, her sons struggled. This Christmas, she had made up her mind. Mr. David and his family would not return from this trip alive. That night, she met with the village witches in a secret location deep in the forest. The air smelled of blood and burnt herbs. The head witch, an old woman with one blind eye, spoke. "Do you have something that belongs to him?" Mama Grace nodded and handed over Mr. David's old shirt and a lock of his hair she had secretly collected years ago. The witches chanted in a language unknown to humans, their voices echoing in the dark night. Spell was cast. "It is done," the head witch said. "His journey will be his last." Back in the city, strange things began happening. Elisa started waking up with scratches on her body, as if something invisible had attacked her in her sleep. Rachel had a nightmare where a dark shadow chased her through an endless road. Daniel kept hearing his name being whispered when no one was around. Even Mr. David, though he wouldn't admit it, felt something was wrong. His car, which was in perfect condition, suddenly refused to start. No mechanic could find the problem. "You see," Lisa said, "something is wrong. We need to cancel the trip." But Mr. David was stubborn. "We can't cancel just because of a silly car problem. We will take a commercial bus." The day of the trip finally came. The family arrived at the bus park. The sun was hot, and the air was filled with the smell of exhaust fumes and fried food from nearby stalls. Lisa felt uneasy. She had begged Mr. David one last time not to go, but he had refused. As they sat in the bus, Lisa closed her eyes and began to pray. People around her stared. Some whispered, "Why is she disturbing everyone?" someone muttered. Even Mr. David rolled his eyes. "Lisa, stop embarrassing me." But Lisa didn't stop. Something told her this journey would not be normal. As the bus started moving, the wind outside howled. Storm was coming. A dark shadow flickered past the window. No one saw it. No one, except Lisa. The bus rumbled along the highway, leaving the city behind. Mr. David sat with his arms crossed, staring out the window. Lisa sat beside him, her lips moving in silent prayer. Behind them, Daniel and Rachel were excited, taking turns looking out the window and talking about all the fun they would have in the village. But Lisa's heart was heavy. The moment the bus moved, she felt a cold presence, as if something unseen had entered with them. She glanced around nervously, but everything seemed normal. Still, her fingers tightened around her Bible. At the front, the bus driver, a middle-aged man with a rough voice, hummed to himself. "Everybody relax. This journey will be smooth, no problem," he shouted. Lisa closed her eyes. "God, let this journey be safe," she whispered. And then, the signs began. Started with Rachel. She suddenly clutched her head. "Mommy, my head is spinning." Lisa turned to her daughter. "Are you feeling sick?" Before Rachel could answer, the bus swerved sharply to avoid a pothole. The passengers gasped as the tires skidded for a brief moment before regaining balance. The driver laughed. "Ah, sorry, oh. This road is bad." Lisa glanced at Mr. David, hoping he would at least acknowledge that something was wrong. But he was calm, completely unbothered. "You worry too much, Lisa," he muttered, adjusting his seat. But Lisa knew this was just the beginning. An hour into the journey, the sky darkened. Storm was coming. The wind outside howled like a wounded animal, and the trees along the roadside bent unnaturally. Then Daniel grabbed his mother's arm. "Mommy." His voice was a whisper. "Someone is calling my name." Lisa's heart skipped. "Who?" Daniel's eyes were wide with fear. "I don't know." "Heard it." Someone whispered. "Daniel, come, come." Lisa's fingers dug into her Bible. "It's just your imagination," she said, but she didn't believe her own words. The bus lurched forward, speeding up suddenly. The driver frowned, tapping the brakes. "Why is this bus moving so fast?" Passengers stirred. "What's happening?" someone asked. The driver pressed the brakes again. Nothing. His hands started to shake. "The brakes, they are not working." Lisa's stomach twisted in fear. Ahead, the road curved sharply, and a small bridge stood at the edge. If the bus couldn't stop, it would go over the bridge into the deep river below. People screamed, "Do something!" The driver yanked the wheel, his knuckles turning white. "Hold on tight." Suddenly, just as the bus neared the curve, a dark figure appeared in the middle of the road. It stood there, tall and unmoving, like a shadow with glowing red eyes. The driver shouted and swerved hard to the left. The bus tilted dangerously. For a moment everything slowed down. Lisa saw the old woman's face flash before her eyes. The one who warned Mr. David. The bus collided with something. The impact sent it flipping over, rolling down the road like a tin can. People screamed. Glass shattered. Lisa grabbed Rachel and Daniel, pulling them close as the world spun around them. Silence. The air was filled with the smell of burning fuel and blood. The bus lay on its side, crushed like paper. The front part was completely destroyed. Bodies lay scattered, some lifeless, others groaning in pain. Lisa blinked through the dust. Daniel. Rachel. They coughed, shaken but alive. She looked around. "David," she cried. Then she saw him. Mr. David lay trapped under a broken seat, blood pooling around him. His legs. They were gone. "David!" Lisa screamed, scrambling towards him. He was conscious, his face pale from shock and pain. I can't feel my legs," he whispered, his voice weak. Tears ran down Lisa's face. "Stay with me. Help is coming." The other passengers who survived crawled out, some helping the wounded, others weeping for the dead. Then, as Lisa held her husband's trembling hand, a voice spoke behind her. "You were warned." The truth revealed. Lisa turned sharply. There stood the old woman, her eyes sorrowful. "You were warned," but he did not listen. Tears streamed down Lisa's face. What happened?" The old woman sighed. "Mama Grace. She cursed this journey. She wanted you all dead." Lisa's breath caught. "No, it can't be." The old woman stepped closer, her voice low. "Your prayers saved you and the children. But your husband, he must now bear the consequences of his arrogance." Lisa turned to Mr. David, who was groaning in pain. She remembered all the times he had mocked her faith. All the times he ignored the signs. Now he had paid the price. Hours later, ambulances arrived. Mr. David was rushed to the hospital. Lisa never left his side. That night, as she watched her husband fight for his life, she whispered, "God, let him live. Even if he never walks again. Just let him live." And for the first time, Mr. David opened his eyes and began to pray. 'Cause now he understood. Now he believed. The sound of beeping machines filled the hospital room. The air was thick with the sharp scent of disinfectant. Lisa sat beside Mr. David's hospital bed, her eyes swollen from crying. Her husband lay motionless, his face pale, his once strong body now weak and bandaged. The lower half of the bed was empty, covered with a blanket that hid the terrible truth. His legs were gone. The doctors had tried everything. The damage was too severe. "You should rest," a nurse whispered to Lisa, touching her shoulder gently. But how could she rest? Her husband, the man who always stood tall with pride, now lay broken. His arrogance had cost him everything. Lisa clutched her Bible. She had prayed for his life. But was this how their story was supposed to end? Just then Daniel and Rachel peeked inside the room, their faces filled with fear. "Mommy, is Daddy going to die?" Rachel whispered. Lisa forced a smile, even though her heart ached. "No, my love. Daddy is going to be fine." But deep inside she wasn't sure. Late that night Lisa stepped outside to get some air. The hospital corridor was silent, except for the occasional cough of another patient in a distant ward. Then she saw her. The old woman from the accident. She stood at the far end of the hallway waiting. Lisa's heart pounded. She knew the woman was not just any ordinary stranger. "You knew this would happen," Lisa said, her voice shaking. The old woman nodded. "I warned him, but he did not listen." Tears rolled down Lisa's cheeks. "Why did this happen? Why my husband?" The old woman's gaze was sad but firm. "Because he refused to believe in what he could not see. His pride blinded him. But your prayers, Lisa, they saved you and your children." Lisa swallowed hard. "And Mama Grace, is she really behind this?" The old woman's face darkened. "Yes, she wanted you all dead. But the power of faith is stronger than the power of evil. That is why you and your children survived." A cold shiver ran down Lisa's spine. Mama Grace. Her mother-in-law had always been distant, but Lisa never imagined she would go this far. "She must be stopped," Lisa whispered. The old woman shook her head. "No, her punishment is already coming. Just wait." Then, without another word, she vanished into thin air. Lisa gasped, clutching her chest. She had no doubt now. This was a battle beyond the physical world. The next morning, Lisa sat by Mr. David's bedside, waiting for him to wake up. She held his hand, her thumb gently rubbing his skin. Finally, his eyes flickered open. For a moment, he stared at the ceiling, confusion filling his expression. Then his gaze shifted to Lisa. She smiled through her tears. "David, you're awake." He opened his mouth, but his voice came out weak. "What happened?" Lisa hesitated. How could she tell him? Then his eyes moved downward towards his legs. He tried to move them, but nothing. Panic flashed across his face. "Lisa, my legs, where are my legs?" She gripped his hand tighter. "David, listen. Where are my legs, Lisa? His voice cracked with desperation. Tears streamed down Lisa's face. The accident, they couldn't save them. The room was silent. Then Mr. David let out a sound that shattered Lisa's heart, a deep, broken sob. His strong hands gripped his blanket as he cried like a child. Why? Why did this happen to me? He choked. Lisa wiped her tears. David, God kept you alive for a reason. His face twisted with anger. A reason? I have no legs, Lisa. What kind of life will I have now? How can I provide for my family? You still have us, Lisa whispered. But Mr. David turned his face away, consumed by pain and regret. He had mocked prayer. He had ignored the warnings. And now he had paid the price. Back in the village, Mama Grace sat in her small hut, waiting for news. When she finally received a phone call from one of her relatives, she smirked, expecting to hear about the family's death. But when she heard that Lisa and the children survived and only Mr. David lost his legs, her smirk faded. What? She snapped. Are you sure they are alive? Yes, Mama, the voice on the phone said. It's a miracle. Only David was badly injured, but his wife and children were not even scratched. A sudden chill ran down Mama Grace's spine. Something had gone wrong. Her plan was to eliminate them all. But instead, Lisa's prayers had saved them. She gritted her teeth. The witches had promised her total destruction, yet now she was the one trembling. Days passed. Mr. David refused to talk. He barely ate. He refused to look at himself in the mirror. The once strong, proud man was now a shadow of himself. One evening, Lisa walked into the room and found him staring at the ceiling. His eyes were hollow. David, she whispered, sitting beside him. I have nothing left, he said flatly. I can't walk. I can't work. What use am I? Lisa held his face in her hands. You're still a father. You're still my husband. And you are still alive. That means God has a plan for you. Tears filled Mr. David's eyes. Lisa, I was wrong. I should have listened to you. I should have prayed. Lisa kissed his forehead. It's not too late. God is still here. For the first time in his entire life, Mr. David closed his eyes and prayed. That night, Mama Grace had a terrifying dream. She was standing in the middle of a dark forest, alone. A cold wind blew, and whispers filled the air. Then she saw them, the witches. But they weren't smiling this time. You failed us, the head witch hissed. Mama Grace took a step back. No. I did everything you asked. You gave us his belongings, another witch sneered. But you underestimated the power of prayer. Suddenly, an invisible force grabbed Mama Grace by the throat. She gasped, struggling to breathe. Please, forgive me. But the witches only laughed. Your punishment is coming. And with that, she woke up screaming. Her body felt weak. Her vision was blurred. And from that night onward, Mama Grace's body began to wither. The curse had returned to her. In the hospital, Mr. David slowly began to change. He no longer mocked Lisa when she prayed. He listened when Daniel and Rachel talked about their dreams. He began to ask for forgiveness, from his wife, from God, and from himself. It was a long journey, but he was finally learning humility. And one evening, as Lisa read the Bible to him, he reached out and held her hand. Lisa, he whispered, I want to go home. Lisa smiled. Then let's go home. The journey back home was quiet. Lisa pushed his wheelchair through their front door, and the house, once filled with his loud voice and proud footsteps, now felt different. The reality of his new life without legs weighed heavily on him. His once dominant presence had faded. He now depended on others. Lisa set up a space for him in the living room. Daniel and Rachel hovered around, unsure how to act. Daddy, do you want me to bring your shoes? Daniel asked innocently. A shadow crossed Mr. David's face. He no longer needed shoes. Lisa squeezed his hand. It's okay, Daniel. Daddy doesn't need them right now. Mr. David felt the sting. His own son had not meant to hurt him, but reality had. And Mama Grace, the woman who caused all this, was still free. Far away in the village, Mama Grace's health was deteriorating. At first, it had started as a simple illness. She had ignored it. But then, her legs began to swell. Soon, dark scars appeared, running up her thighs like veins of death. Her sons, whom she had fought so hard to elevate over Mr. David, watched in horror as their mother screamed in pain every night. She visited herbalists, pastors, and traditional healers. But the answer was always the same. This was a curse of her own making. The spirits have turned against you, one herbalist had said. The blood you sought to spill has returned to claim you instead. Mama Grace refused to believe it. She had always been in control, always pulling the strings. But now she was the one being dragged down. Mr. David's regret and transformation. Back in the city, Mr. David struggled to adjust to his new life. He hated the wheelchair. He hated feeling weak. But what he hated most was himself. One afternoon, Lisa found him staring out the window, lost in thought. She pulled a chair beside him. "What are you thinking?" Mr. David sighed. "About everything I ignored. The warnings, the dreams, the old woman." Lisa nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I used to think praying was foolish," he whispered. "That you were wasting your time. That faith was for the weak." His voice cracked. "But Lisa, now I see. I was the foolish one." Lisa took his hand in hers. "God kept you alive for a reason, David. Even if you can't walk, you're still here. That means He's not finished with you yet." Tears filled Mr. David's eyes. "I don't know how to start over, Lisa." She smiled softly. "Start by praying." And for the first time since childhood, Mr. David prayed. Not because he was forced to, but because he truly wanted to. A week later, something strange happened. Lisa was preparing dinner when a knock came at the door. When she opened it, her heart nearly stopped. It was the old woman. The same woman who had warned Mr. David before the journey. Lisa's mouth went dry. How did you find us?" The old woman smiled faintly. "The same way I knew what was coming." Lisa stepped aside, letting her in. Mr. David turned in his wheelchair and gasped. "You?" The old woman nodded. "Do you believe now?" His throat tightened. "Yes, I do." She sat down across from him, her eyes filled with a deep knowing. "Mama Grace is paying for what she did," she said. "The spirits have judged her. She is suffering. But now she must confess." Lisa's heartbeat quickened. "Confess?" The old woman nodded. "She is running out of time. She knows she will not survive this unless she speaks the truth. And when she does, she will call for you, David." A heavy silence filled the room. Mr. David swallowed hard. Would he be able to face the woman who cursed him? Back in the village, Mama Grace had finally reached her breaking point. She had tried everything, but her condition only worsened. Her legs had swollen twice their size, the skin turning black and peeling. She could no longer walk. One evening, she called her eldest son. "I need you to do something for me," she rasped. "What is it, Mama?" he asked. "Call David," she whispered. Her son stiffened. "David." Mama Grace nodded weakly. "I have to confess before it's too late." It was a quiet evening when Lisa's phone rang. She looked at the screen and froze. It was a number from the village. Her heart pounded as she answered. "Hello." A hesitant voice spoke. "It's me, Mama Grace's son." Lisa sat up straight. "What do you want?" "Oz. Mama wants to speak to David." Lisa's breath caught. "She's sick," the voice continued. "She says she has something to confess." Lisa turned to Mr. David, who had been listening. His hand shook. This was the moment he had never expected. Would he answer? Would he forgive? He closed his eyes. "Put her on the phone." The phone crackled as Mama Grace's weak voice came through. "David." Mr. David felt a strange mix of anger and pity. "Do you know what you've done to me?" he asked. His voice was quiet but filled with years of pain. Mama Grace coughed. "I know, my son. And I am sorry." Tears filled her voice. "I let jealousy rule me. I tried to destroy you, but now I am the one being destroyed." Mr. David swallowed the lump in his throat. "You cursed me," he whispered. "You took my legs." "I know," she wept. "And I regret it every second." Silence hung between them. "Can you ever forgive me?" she choked. Lisa watched her husband, her heart aching for him. Finally, after what felt like eternity, Mr. David exhaled deeply. "I forgive you, Mama." A sharp cry came from the other end of the phone. And then the line went dead. That night, Mama Grace breathed her last breath. The next morning, her body was found peaceful, her swollen legs finally normal. The curse had been lifted. Her jealousy had taken her life. When Lisa and David heard the news, they did not celebrate. Instead, they sat in silence, holding each other. David felt lighter. He had lost his legs, but he had found his soul. From that day on, he never mocked prayer again. And when he finally returned to the village, he was no longer a proud man, but a humble one. A village in mourning. The news of Mama Grace's death spread through the village like wildfire. People whispered in hushed voices, some in shock, others in quiet understanding. Some villagers believed she had died from sickness, but the elders knew the truth. The curse had come full circle. In life she had chosen jealousy. In death she had paid the price. But now the question remained. What would become of her sons? 2 weeks after Mama Grace's burial, Mr. David sat by the window, staring outside. For days, he had struggled with his emotions. He had forgiven her. But deep inside, there was still a part of him that ached with pain. Lisa walked in and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're thinking about the village?" He nodded. "I need to go back." Lisa was silent for a moment. Then she squeezed his hand. "Then let's go." Mr. David turned to look at her, surprised. "You're not afraid?" She smiled. "Not anymore." When Mr. David's family arrived in the village, the people were waiting. Some watched in shock, unable to believe their eyes. Others murmured, their voices filled with regret. The proud, tall Mr. David who had once walked with authority now sat in a wheelchair. The same man who had once mocked prayer had now become its living testimony. His brothers stood at a distance, guilt etched across their faces. Finally, the eldest one stepped forward. "David, we are sorry." Silence hung in the air. Mr. David studied them for a long moment before saying, "I forgive you." Tears filled their eyes. For years they had watched their mother try to destroy their brother, and in the end she had destroyed herself. Now all that remained was regret. But Mr. David had moved on. And as the village looked on, they realized something. This man, once blinded by pride, had now become a different kind of leader. One who had seen the power of faith. One who had learned the cost of ignoring spiritual warnings. And one who had survived where others would have perished. Though Mama Grace had paid with her life, the village elders knew the witches who had helped her still existed. And justice had to be served. One evening, as the elders gathered, they made a decision. The witches would be banished. A special ritual was performed, severing their connection to the village's spirits. That night a strange thing happened. The witches, sensing their power fading, fled the village under the cover of darkness. By morning they were nowhere to be found. The village was free. And peace returned once more. As time passed, Lisa became known throughout the village as the woman whose prayers had saved her family. Many wives who had once felt powerless now came to her for guidance. She spoke to them softly, reminding them of the strength that comes from faith. She told them, "Never stop praying. Even when people mock you, even when they don't believe, never stop. Because one day they will see the truth." And they listened, because Lisa had lived it. Though Mr. David could no longer walk, his spirit had never been stronger. He opened a foundation in the city, dedicated to helping accident survivors adjust to life after trauma. He visited hospitals, speaking to those who had lost hope. And when people asked, "How did you survive?" he only had one answer: "Because my wife never stopped praying for me." For the first time in his life, he understood the power of prayer. And now he wanted others to see it too. Years later, Daniel and Rachel grew up hearing the full story of what happened that year. One day, Daniel asked his mother, "Mom, do you think Daddy would have survived if you didn't pray?" Lisa smiled, pulling him close. "I don't know, my son. But I do know one thing. Prayer made all the difference." Rachel's eyes widened. "So, will bad people always get punished?" Lisa sighed. "Not always. But the truth is, no one escapes their own actions forever. Mama Grace thought she could play with evil, but in the end, evil played with her." Daniel and Rachel nodded thoughtfully. And as Lisa tucked them into bed, she whispered, "Never forget, faith is the most powerful weapon of all." As the years passed, Mr. David and Lisa's story became a lesson in both the village and the city.